Okay, we're here on the day that Business Europe has released the findings of its survey on industry. What are the general findings of that report?
So we talked to about 500 business leaders and policymakers around Europe to really try and do two things. One was to get a flavour of sort of how they saw industry, what was the state of play today. And secondly, as we think about growth opportunities in Europe, what was the importance of manufacturing? And I suppose the first message that I would say is actually there's a mixed view at the moment. Business leaders are concerned about the underlying economic situation in Europe, but despite that, they're actually still quite positive about the underlying competitiveness. We see quite a wide divergence of views. I think clearly the Germans feel that we are more competitive in Europe than, for example, the Spanish would do. But the underlying message out of all of this is that manufacturing is seen as a critical backbone for growth in Europe going forward. And that's true whether you're talking to people in services or in manufacturing. And so the message, I think, is that manufacturing is critical for Europe's well-being going forward because it generates jobs not only in manufacturing, but also critically there's a multiplier effect into services. And so what Europe needs to do is build on its strengths, but at the same time actually exploit some of those underlying sort of waves of growth that exist, whether that's in technology, changes in consumer behavior, or in energy.
Okay, there's two sort of points that I want to pick up on. You said, there's a disparity of opinion between, say, Germany and Spain. First of all, why is that so? Is that because of differences in the economic makeup and the industrial makeup, I should say, of those countries?
Yes, so when we did the survey, we tried to make sure that there was a representative sample from the five major countries. So Germany, France, UK, Italy and Spain. And so what we've got is results split by country. So when we asked some of the questions, for example, around competitiveness, you could see where the trends were. If you looked at some of the data around, for example, the competitiveness of the European workforce, again, there were different sort of views. In fact, interestingly, the Italians were quite positive in terms of the skills of the workforce going forward. And then there was another question which we looked at particularly, which was around the European Commission's objective of reaching 20% of manufacturing in GDP by 2020. And again, what we noticed there was the Germans were much more upbeat about us achieving that objective, whereas the Italians were actually quite pessimistic that we would get there.
But I mean, the second point then is industrial policy favourable towards manufacturing? We hear a lot about the new economy and research and innovation and things like that. I mean, is manufacturing still a key point in thinking on the European Commission, for instance?
What we would, I think, highlighting through the report, and we've seen that the Commission has taken a much more active interest in manufacturing now, is I think this general recognition that what the European Commission needs to do is work at both the European level and in conjunction with member states about what it is that we can do to promote the conditions for manufacturing to grow. And the message here is that Europe has got a lot of strengths. You can look at the automotive sector, pharmaceuticals, engineering sectors, but they differ by country. And so what we need to be able to do is leverage the strengths in manufacturing that we've got in different parts of Europe, but at the same time take advantage of some of these waves that we've talked about, whether they are what's happening in terms of advanced technology. Think about what's happening with cars today. Cars are as much about electronics, technology, software as they are about the metal that you're sort of pressing in order to shape cars. And if Europe is going to succeed going forward, it's got to capitalize on those strengths, leverage those technology advances, and also sell it not just into Europe, but into some of the growth markets abroad as well.
So I'll talk about the growth markets abroad in a second. Are we talking about a re-education of the European workforce, or just a sort of a recognition by member state governments that there should be more of a coordination between different sectors?
Well, when one looks at what we can do at the European level, there's always a sort of demand and supply element to this. So I think critically we need to keep looking at the single market. A lot of issues still about how we get harmonization, particularly around regulations. And clearly, although we've got high unemployment in Europe, there are still a lot of issues around skills. We're probably 500,000 engineers short in Europe at the moment. And so one of the critical things is making sure that we have the right sorts of policies which are developing the skills not just for today, but also for tomorrow. And that is obviously going to take time to work through. But clearly also there are variations in terms of what people are looking for to help support sort of manufacturing. So some countries are much more concerned about energy prices, others are concerned about red tape, and other countries, particularly in Southern Europe, are very concerned about having the right incentives, particularly for research and development. So the point is that you have to flex the policy levers depending on what parts of Europe you're talking about and also which sectors you're focusing on.
Does Europe have time? You mentioned in your answer there that there's sort of we need time to develop this. Does Europe have time? We've got other emerging economies. We often hear about the threat of China, India, Brazil, for instance. I mean, how rapidly does Europe need to move on this issue?
Well, clearly there's an urgency, and part of that urgency is political, because a lot of the political leaders are concerned about growth and clearly on jobs. So I think there is an urgency. There's a recognition, though, that there is, I think, a significant opportunity for Europe to essentially leverage some of its strengths. It's got the advantage of how it can move into some of those growth markets, because when you look at what Europe's got, it's got a lot of brand strength. It's got technology and technology skills, a lot of core sort of industrial strength. The question is whether it can package those together in a way that can take advantage of some of those growth trends that we see over the course of the rest of the decade. And the key message I think that's come out of the report is that if Europe really does focus on its manufacturing base, it will help with exports, because 80% of all exports come out of essentially a manufacturing base, but it will also help with job creation, and it will also help with spurring R&D, because a lot of R&D is also based on technologies which go into manufacturing.
But can Europe now afford to put money into R&D, which is a sort of a long-term thing? The crisis, it's very, the economic crisis it does have obviously an immediate effect on public opinion. How can we afford to be long? How can the Commission or the European Union afford to be long-term and maintain voter confidence and citizen confidence?
Yeah. Well, clearly it's a portfolio issue. If you look at recoveries, some of it relates to private consumption, private investment, what you're doing with net exports, and what governments are doing around consumption and investment. So I think that where you can see opportunity is that if governments can create and continue to create the basis of financial stability, you have the opportunity, for example, to release more private investment, in other words, release balance sheet cash out of large corporates in order to invest in assets both in Europe and abroad. The other big thing that governments can do is they can use their investment monies to be able to leverage up private investment. So if you look at issues like in infrastructure investment, look at broadband, for example, it's both a combination of public money and private money. So yes, there are some hard choices to be made, but I think the critical measure is that if you want to actually make sure that the Europe goes forward and recovers and grows, you have to get the balance right between what the private sector can do, what the public sector can do, and balancing investment and consumption.
Is that an answerable question at this point?
Yeah, I think that, again, it varies a little bit sort of country by country, and we already see that there are wide variations in terms of the amount, for example, of GDP that's invested in research and development, and it varies very significantly across Europe. I think the key message here is that ultimately there's a lot of concern around, for example, jobs. If you want to create sustainable jobs over time, we've got to look at both short-term measures as well as longer-term measures to create both inclusive growth but also jobs that are going to be sustainable over time. Manufacturing is one of those key places where we can get, I think, sustainable jobs over time.
Thanks for that. We're going to have to really edit that. Yeah. Stupid announcers. God, I've lost my train of thought. I was going to ask you one more question.
So we were talking there about sort of the balance of investment versus consumption.
Yeah. I'm going to have to phrase this right. Sorry, Rami. Yeah, you spoke about short-term measures and long-term measures. Perhaps you could expand upon that. I mean, are you talking about long-term investment versus short-term sort of injection of capital into things like the youth employment guarantee scheme? I mean, just perhaps expand on that.
So, if you look at sort of measures that can improve, sort of, for example, skills, clearly there are things that we can do to encourage more people to go into, for example, engineering. But there are other things that you can do to do sort of quick sort of retraining, particularly in some aspects of technology or ICT. So you need a mixture of sort of policies, both in terms of retraining, as well as also making sure that people coming into the labour market going forward have got the right sorts of combination of skills. I think that's one thing. I think there are other things that you can do, particularly in terms of tax and financial incentives, to help encourage R&D. Remember, a lot of the jobs that are going to get created are by smaller companies. So if you can create flexible conditions whereby you can take more apprenticeships on, whereby you can sort of support people in jobs in the short term, that both helps with job creation, but also creates the platform for the future. So I don't think sort of investment has to always be in what I would describe the big blockbuster projects. Clearly the infrastructure projects help over time, whether that's physical or digital. Plus you can put a lot of investment into what I would call bigger R&D types of projects. But actually there's a lot that you can do, particularly in terms of the way that you use tax, the way that you encourage banks to lend to SMEs, which will help with short-term job creation, which I think is an important lever as part of the overall growth story.